The film opens with an introduction to Roy Freeman, a detective specializing in homicide cases who has already left his police career behind. After undergoing surgery for an accident, Roy wakes up with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, which causes a progressive loss of memory of both his past and his own identity. One day, he receives a phone call from a woman named Emily Dietz. She claims to work for a non-profit legal defense organization known as the Clean Hands Project, which is dedicated to supporting inmates who have been neglected by the justice system. Emily asked to meet with Roy to discuss a case he participated in approximately a decade ago. In the next scene, they both meet in a bar. Emily explains that the case involves Isaac Samuel, a man who is currently on death row. He was accused of the murder of Professor Joseph Wilder. Roy confesses that he remembers nothing about the incident. Emily shows him a newspaper clipping about the crime and informs him that Isaac expressed a particular interest in having Roy help him. At his residence, Roy reviews a box full of old case files, trying to remember in the hope that something will trigger his memory. While examining the papers, he begins to experience flashbacks that provide him with fragments of past memories. The next day, he goes to the prison to visit Isaac. The inmate thanks Roy for having caged him, but insists that he is at the end of his rope and that he is innocent of the murder he is accused of. He narrates how the night of the crime went, assuring Roy that although he was present at the scene, someone arrived before him and committed the homicide. Isaac, frankly, got nervous and fled before he could get a better look at who the person responsible was. Roy maintains a skeptical attitude, but Isaac recommends he speak with Richard Finn, an investigator who was writing a book about the case and who visited them recently. Isaac asks Roy to fix things before it's too late. Determined to activate his memory and following his doctor's instructions, Roy decides to get involved in police work again. He contacts Jimmy Rems, his former partner, and explains how much his condition has worsened and the state of Isaac Samuel. Roy suspects that Isaac might be innocent and wants to reopen the investigation. Jimmy agrees to collaborate, although with an expression that suggests he might be hiding something. Later, Roy receives a call from Jimmy, who informs him that he has located Richard Finn. When Roy arrives at the location, he discovers that Finn has died from an apparent fentanyl overdose, although he notes that there is only one needle mark on his arm, which raises his suspicion that he wasn't an addict. Suddenly, a memory hits him. Roy remembers having seen Richard at the original crime scene. Jimmy reminds him that Isaac's fingerprints were all over the house and that Isaac confessed to the double homicide. He advises Roy to abandon the case, assuring him that the dead don't talk, but Roy refuses to give up, convinced that the dead do leave clues and communicate in some way. In the next scene, Roy attends Richard's funeral, where he meets Eddie Finn, the deceased's brother. Roy mentions that he is investigating the case that Richard had shown an interest in solving and asks him about the manuscript that Isaac mentioned. Eddie leads him to his car and hands him a draft titled The Book of Mirrors. Roy dismisses it as nonsense, although he acknowledges that Richard always seemed to be someone who was not involved with drugs. He takes the book home in the hope of finding a clue to uncover the truth. As he begins to read The Book of Mirrors, the film adopts a distinct visual style to show the story narrated by Richard in the first person. The scenes recreate the events surrounding Professor Wilder's murder, pointing out that everything was orchestrated by a woman named Laura Baines. The story begins at a lively party where Richard arrives and finds Laura. She approaches him and they engage in a casual conversation. A connection soon emerges, and they introduce themselves as Richard and Laura. Laura explains that she is attending the celebration with Professor Wilder, who helps her with her thesis work. Richard watches her play with a pendant and remembers that he once read in a book that when a woman manipulates her jewelry, she is often interested in flirting. The chemistry between the two intensifies rapidly, and in the next scene, they are intimate in a scene filled with passion, marking the beginning of a fiery relationship. 2 months later, Richard receives news of his father's death from a heart attack and that his mother can no longer afford his lodging or food. Laura offers to help him and introduces him to Wilder, who invites them both to dinner. During the meal, Wilder explains that he has been working on a joint project with Laura that combines a pharmaceutical formula and a psychological method to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. He even tests the substance on Richard, impressing the young man with its effects. After dinner, Wilder shows him his space full of books and experiments. Excited and curious, Richard agrees to collaborate on the professor's work. Over the next few days, he helps organize and catalog Wilder's research. Over time, he notices that the relationship between Laura and Wilder is becoming closer, arousing suspicions that this friendship might be more than just professional. One night, he receives a voicemail from Laura saying she will be late because she is in the lab with Wilder. With rage, Richard secretly enters the professor's house and finds Laura and Wilder in the midst of an intimate moment. Heartbroken, he returns to his house and secretly keeps what he has seen. The next day, while working, he discovers a manuscript titled The Mirror Effect. It only has Wilder's name on it, but in one corner, it is handwritten, "For Laura." Suddenly, Wilder enters, takes the document, and suggests they have breakfast. During the meal, the professor confronts Richard about his relationship with Laura. The young man denies having anything with her, but Wilder doesn't believe him and warns him to stay away from her. Later, Richard arrives at his home and finds that Laura has disappeared. She has packed all her belongings and has not returned. The next day, Professor Wilder is found dead, and at the scene, a drug addict confesses to being the culprit of the homicide. However, a week before the crime, Laura had visited Susan Avery, who was a contact for Wilder at the Department of Defense, to claim ownership of his research. After the professor's death, Laura disappeared without a trace. Unfortunately, Richard did not finish the Book of Mirrors, leaving the story inconclusive and Roy still without a definitive closure. Determined to find answers, Roy goes to Richard's wife, Dana. She shares her perception, describing Richard as increasingly paranoid and shouting on the phone. One day, she secretly calls the number Richard had been dialing, and a woman answers. At that moment, she also begins to suspect that Laura may have been involved in her husband's death, especially since there was never any evidence that he used drugs. With all this information, Roy delves deeper into the investigation and finally finds Laura. He confronts her and gives her Richard's manuscript, asking her to read it. She accepts it without protest, and Roy leaves. The next scene shows Roy receiving a message from Jimmy that says, "I found Wilder's caretaker. His name is Wayne DeVerix." Roy goes to look for him. During the conversation, Wayne reveals that Professor Wilder had been developing a medication to cure PTSD. He was one of the first experimental subjects chosen for the trauma he suffered in Iraq. Although the drug showed promising results, its side effects were intense, and Wayne stopped taking it. On the way back, Roy asks Wayne to accompany him to his house. During the ride, Wayne comments on disturbing details he experienced at Wilder's property, particularly that the professor had a collection of sexual recordings with several women. After a long drive, Wayne drops Roy off in front of his house and before leaving, makes a call in which he says, "I'm home now." Minutes later, Roy goes out to get food, and on his way, a truck slowly approaches and seems to want to run him over. Quick on his feet, Roy pulls out his gun and shoots the vehicle, killing the driver. When he gets closer, he discovers that the driver is Wayne DeVerix. Without delay, he calls the police and reports what happened. The scene shifts to the station, where Roy sits silently, looking at an old file. That same day, he confronts Jimmy and accuses him of being involved in Professor Wilder's murder. He explains that after reviewing 30 years of cases, he found that both Jimmy's name and his former partner's name were linked to all these cases. Curiously, the Wilder case file never mentions Roy, only Jimmy. Hurt and furious, Jimmy spits at him and leaves, shouting that after so many years of working together, Roy is now accusing him of being responsible. Plunged into guilt and confusion, Roy begins to drink excessively, ignoring medical warnings. He drinks bottle after bottle of whiskey until he is completely unconscious. When he wakes up, he is on the side of the road, and he stumbles into a nearby bar. He asks the bartender to bring him Diane, his deceased wife, who used to work there. The bartender calmly informs him that she died 5 years ago. Roy asks to use the bathroom, and there he begins to experience vivid visions of the original crime scene. Just then, he receives a call from Susan Avery, Wilder's contact at the Department of Defense. She explains that Wilder had developed a powerful PTSD treatment, but was killed before completing his research. Now, a modified version of the formula appears under Laura's name. Susan gives him a copy of the book and the address of Wilder's house. Upon arriving, Roy feels an inexplicable sense of déjà vu, as if he had been there before. He takes a metal fork from the garden and begins to dig in a specific spot on the ground. He finally discovers a bat, the same one used in the murder. Suddenly, Laura appears, accompanied by Jimmy, who is holding a gun. Jimmy orders Roy to put the bat back in the hole and to go inside the house. Roy accuses them of having killed Professor Wilder, but Jimmy insists that's not what happened. He assures him that Laura was the one who killed Richard and that she used Wayne as a patsy. Roy confronts them, pointing out that both Laura and Jimmy knew each other well and that both participated in the events. The truth begins to emerge. Laura was the true perpetrator of Richard's murder, and Jimmy blackmailed her after discovering that she stole Wilder's research. To cover it up, Jimmy helped frame Isaac, thus concealing his involvement in the professor's murder. Jimmy confesses that everything was for money to pay for his sick wife's treatment, but it remains to be solved who actually killed Wilder. Jimmy tries to convince Roy that Laura is a manipulator who uses people for her own gain and then leaves them alone. Before leaving, Laura shoots him. She then aims at Roy, but Jimmy intervenes, shooting her in the chest and killing her. Dying, Jimmy looks at Roy and says, "I did this for you, Roy." Roy calls the police and confesses the whole truth. With his testimony and the evidence collected, Isaac finally achieves his freedom. Roy then returns home, sits down to put together his puzzle, and approaches the wall to take down an old wedding photograph of him and Diane. Suddenly, a final wave of memories floods his mind. He remembers a meeting with Laura at the bar where Diane used to work. At that meeting, Laura told him that Diane was being manipulated by Wilder. Richard didn't believe her until she showed him a recording. Upon arriving at his house and playing it, he saw Diane in sessions with Wilder. Consumed by rage, Richard went to Wilder's house with a bat and killed him. Isaac was also there and witnessed the murder, although he fled the scene. Jimmy, upon seeing what happened, decided to cover it up and make everyone believe that Isaac was the culprit to protect him. Now, with all his memories clear, Roy silently picks up his gun and walks away from the scene.